JFI webinar. It is Holy Week, and we wish you all a blessed Holy Week. Today, we are joined by a research team from the University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. I'll let my colleague Todd Scribner in a moment introduce these outstanding and really smart researchers. A few housekeeping items, though. You all are muted so that we're able to have this webinar today free of background noises. There are opportunities for folks to ask questions in the chat box on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. So I'm going to type something in there in just a moment, and hopefully you'll all see it. So that's where you can pose any questions you have as they come up to the presenters. One other item is hopefully tomorrow, it might happen as soon as tonight, this webinar will be posted on the justiceforimmigrants.org webinar page, and I'll put a link to that webinar page in the chat box as well. Okay, so, I'm sorry, one more item. If there are any members of the press or media on the call, please identify yourself in the chat box. This webinar is intended for our JFI audience, and we ask members of the media to identify themselves just in case we need to provide you more information, whether it's background or clarifying resources for any story or any piece you might be putting together. Okay, so excuse me. With that, I want to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Todd Scribner, the Education Coordinator here at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and Migration and Refugee Services. Todd, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Tony. You can hear me okay?
Hear you just fine, Todd.
Awesome. So I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate everyone who's joining us for this webinar, particularly the research team, as well as Stephen Reifenberg, who's the co-director of the Integration Lab at the Keough School. I'm going to turn it over to him in a few minutes, but I just wanted to say a few words before I do. About 2 years ago, we sort of initiated a partnership with Notre Dame, and it really centered on sort of bringing several researchers sort of into sort of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops orbit to focus on issues of importance to us, particularly migration issues, given our role here at the conference. And so over about a year period, we pulled together, a research plan that looks at enforcement. I'm not going to give too much away because that'll be the researcher's responsibility. But it looks at enforcement issues in Greece, Germany, and along the U.S.-Mexico border, sort of at a comparative perspective. A lot of work put into it, pulling it all together. And really now we're at the culmination of that project. They released a report a couple months ago. And one of the major purposes of this webinar today is to highlight some of the findings of the report and also to get their name out there. If you have any questions in terms of follow-up, I'm sure they'd be happy to do so either in the Q&A session or later on in the coming days. One of the things, the upsides, I think, to this project, at least from my perspective, is that it really demonstrates the ways in which different types of Catholic institutions can come together and work for sort of the good in different ways. So, a university, it's a research center, and Notre Dame is one of the great research centers here in the United States. The USCCB, we don't have that kind of expertise. We don't have the bodies on the ground. We don't have the students that come in and out. We don't have just the capacity to do the kind of research that a university can do. But we're really closely involved, obviously, on issues related to migration and migration policy here at Migration and Refugee Services. And so bringing our expertise in the policy arena and marrying that in a way to the expertise in the research arena in particular of a university like Notre Dame really allows us to do things that neither of us can do on our own very effectively. And so I think the past 2 years has really demonstrated sort of an important endeavor that we hope will be replicated with other institutions, between other institutions and other universities that are Catholic, and also with, from our perspective, with other institutions as well, other universities. And we, of course, hope to and plan to continue on this partnership with Notre Dame. That's something we'll talk about a little bit more at the end, because we want to get your insights as well as we move forward to the next project that we hope to pick up beginning this summer in the early planning stages at that point. So I'm going to turn it over now to Steve Reifenberg. He can explain a little bit about his program, about the project, however he'd like, and just to give you insights as to where they're coming from at Notre Dame. So, Steve, I'm happy to hear what you have to say.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Todd, and it's a delight to be on the line today with this kind of community of very committed people who are working on issues related to immigration policy, and how it affects the lives of lots and lots of people. And so as Todd mentioned, we have been in partnership for really the last year and a half, working very closely with Todd and his colleague, Ashley Feasley, on a project here in what we call the Integration Lab at the University of Notre Dame. And I thought I'd just give about 90 seconds of background just to give a little bit of context of where this group is coming from. As Todd was mentioning, it really has been a very important partnership for us coming from the university to work with the USCCB and this community of practice. And so when we talk about the Integration Lab, this is a program primarily working with master's students at Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. And when we describe it, we often talk about three things. We talk about a physical space. We're right now in the laboratory itself, which is in the lower level of the Keough School, lots and lots of whiteboards and movable furniture and Post-its for the student teams and faculty working on projects to actually be able to work in teams. We talk about a 2-year curricular arc of training students and really thinking about how you link theory with practice and how you take the ideas of a research institution and really translate those into meaningful work. And finally, we talk about partnership, which is at the center of our work, partnering with organizations like the USCCB and a number of other international organizations where they essentially put forward as challenge that they're really interested in having a team of students and faculty work on for a year-long arc. And we've had the good fortune to work very closely with Father Dan Grudy, a faculty member in our theology department who does a lot of work on the theology of immigration, and with our colleagues at the USCCB, working on a proposal that was framed from the perspective of the USCCB, and as Todd suggested, that we could then deploy, as Tony said, this very outstanding and really smart group of 4 young graduate students to spend time here in the lab researching it, to go out into the field on the U.S.-Mexico border, Greece and Germany, and to really come back with some insights into the work that they've been doing on the more humane immigration enforcement and thinking about pathways forward. And as Todd suggested at the end, we're going to just say a word. Todd will say a word about a project that we're planning going forward, and we'll look forward to kind of advice and suggestions that many of you have for thinking about that future work. So I'm going to turn it over to our 4-person student team. I'll ask them to introduce themselves when they speak, and we're going to begin with Patrick Calderon.
Hey,
Hi. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Oh, sorry.
Steve, before we go on, I'm going to ask if you can put the link, if you can type in the link to the Keough School there in the chat box. This webinar is being recorded, so as folks are going to be viewing the webinar in the future, they might want to see what opportunities there are at your great program there at Notre Dame. So
sure.
If you can do that, please do. Go ahead, Patrick.
Perfect. So I can put those links up, the link to the Keough School's general website and the link to the report actually maybe in 5 minutes. So I'll put those up there pretty shortly. But I'd just like to say good afternoon to everyone, and I'd like to thank everyone here for joining us. We're very, very grateful for the chance to speak with all of you this afternoon. My name, as Steve said, is Patrick Calderon. I am originally from Canada. I'm here with my colleague.
Hi, I'm Shu Yuan from China.
Hi, I'm Kathleen from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Hi, I'm Mehek from Pakistan.
And today we'd like to introduce you to a report that was researched and produced over the past year in collaboration with the Department of Migration and Refugee Services over at the USCCB. And this report is entitled Humane Immigration Enforcement, The Way Forward. As you might imagine, at Notre Dame, there's a big focus on bridging ethics and practice. And at the Keough School in particular, we're all about looking at public policy and public policy challenges through a normative lens. So what we do in our report is we compare the situation of 3 different countries with respect to immigration enforcement and we look at those issues through an ethical or normative perspective. Next slide, please. We wanted to look big picture and ask these overarching questions. First, what does it mean for immigration enforcement to be humane? And in fact, given kind of the current state of the U.S. immigration enforcement system, one of our questions was, is it even possible to reform the system sufficiently so that it is humane? And secondly, we wanted to ask how state policies measure up to standards of humane immigration enforcement. And we wanted to look at these questions with respect to the post-arrival side of immigration enforcement, which means that we looked at how migrants are housed, whether or not they're detained, how the asylum process works, how efficient it is, and how fair it is to migrants. And we wanted also to look at the procedures for deporting and repatriating migrants. And from our lived experience on the ground, we went to the U.S.-Mexico border, to Germany, Greece, and Washington, D.C. over 2 months in the summer of 2018 doing research. And from speaking with migrants and the people who work with migrants, we derived 5 principles of humane immigration enforcement that we're going to outline for you in the coming minutes. Our hypothesis is that these 5 principles, followed properly, would constitute a humane immigration enforcement system. And so I'm going to pass out to my colleague Kathleen. Next slide, please.
So to carry out this project, we spent about 2 months interviewing migrants, advocates, and service providers on the ground in Greece, Germany, and in 3 cities along the U.S.-Mexico border, as Patrick said. We're interviewing them about their perspectives on what is and is not working in their respective immigration enforcement systems in terms of protections for migrants. And we chose these places to study, first because they're all major migrant-receiving countries or places, because Greece has a significant border and is an initial reception site into the EU, and because Germany, like the United States, has a lot of resources, is a global norm setter, and is a primary destination country for migrants and refugees in the region. So we then came back and analyzed our findings, comparing across contexts and highlighting promising interventions within each system that address major flaws. And we offered general recommendations based on the comments that people shared on the ground. And as we were analyzing our findings, we eventually realized that the comments that our interviewees were making about their visions for more humane immigration enforcement systems could be summarized into a few areas. Comments about detention and liberty, about the legal process, and about deportation practices. Combining these with ideas from Catholic social teaching, we broke them up into 5 normative statements or principles about what kinds of protections must be present in an immigration enforcement system to make it humane for migrants with respect to the post-arrival side of the system. So in the next few minutes, we'd like to give you a broad overview of the report and highlight why we think this approach could be useful for future analysis and dialogue across contexts. Given the limited time today, we're just going to highlight the principles and a few examples of the kinds of interventions within the systems that could lead to the development of more humane systems and enforcement. I believe we're on to the next slide.
So the first area we're focused on is immigration detention. Immigration detention was originally not within the scope of our research. But it was such a salient issue that we couldn't avoid when talking with different stakeholders. As we all know, U.S. maintains the largest immigration detention system in the world. The average daily population of migrants in detention in the U.S. rose from 6,785 to 38,106 between fiscal year 1994 and 2017. They are held in prison-like facilities, and their freedom of movement is completely constrained. We talked to detainees who was in those detention centers and also deported migrants about their lives inside those facilities. Their stories, together with various reports from advocacy groups and even the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, identified a wide range of problems, including the freezing temperature, unhealthy and non-nutritious foods, poor and insufficient medical treatment, lack of access to legal information, etc. In comparison, the reception conditions in Germany are arguably better and more humane based on our observation. Reception centers, which host migrants who do not come from safe countries defined by the German law, generally have better conditions. We visited a reception center in Donauwörth, Bavaria, and saw migrants coming in and out freely. They just need to register on a daily basis. This is very, very different from the detention centers in the U.S., where migrants' liberty is deprived entirely. Reception centers also offer courses to facilitate migrants' integration into German life, including language and cultural courses. But there's another type of facilities which are called the transit centers, where migrants from safe countries are hosted. They have worse conditions in general and do not provide those integration courses. Reception conditions in Greece were similar but were worse in general than those in Germany. Conditions in those temporary camps and island hotspots where basic amenities are often lacking and where overcrowding is common, especially subbar. The tents in which migrants are housed in hotspots leave them exposed to the inclement weather and other safety hazards. In February 2017, 3 migrants reportedly died from the cold on the camps on Lesbos. We personally spoke to migrants living in those camps and heard about those terrible conditions. So drawing lessons from our field experience and the existing legal and moral instruments, such as the Catholic Social Teaching and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, etc., we propose 2 principles concerning the immigration detention that we believe a humane immigration enforcement system should comply with. First, enforcement system should have a presumption against the deprivation of migrants' liberty, giving preferences to dignified alternatives to formal detention and ensuring that families are neither detained or separated. Second, accommodations for migrants, whether in reception facilities or detention centers, should be dignified and should provide for basic needs and access to appropriate resources. Next slide, please.
So principles 3 and 4 are regarding rights and protections for migrants while they're within the legal system. So 2 fundamental problems we heard about in all 3 contexts were the lack of information provided to migrants during their legal processes, whether applying for asylum or for legal immigration status, and the substantial waiting times for status determinations that left migrants in limbo. For example, migrants in Arizona described waiting in detention for months on end with no information on their case. And likewise, asylum seekers that we talked to in Greece described waiting over a year for a mere registration appointment, which would give them status as asylum seekers, and which forced them to sleep on the streets of Athens in the meantime rather than in refugee camps. Like in the United States, asylum seekers in Greece generally do not have the right to a lawyer, and the free legal aid available is inadequate in comparison to the need, which leaves migrants and asylum seekers confused and stuck in systems that they don't know how to navigate. Thus, these principles put forth that in a humane system, migrants must receive the appropriate guidance and information in navigating the enforcement system and must receive individual assessments and due process protections in a reasonable time frame.
We saw promising legal interventions taking place, particularly in the Greek and U.S. context at the NGO level, that were attempting to build better systems of information provision and individual assessment for migrants waiting for legal status determinations. The Greek Council for Refugees, for example, is a large Greek-run NGO that offers free representation and legal advice for migrants in detention and asylum seekers on the islands. They also have strong ties to the Greek government and international NGOs, which allows them to engage in advocacy to influence policy. They are similar to the Florence Project based out of Florence, Arizona, whose legal orientation program has been very successful and has been scaled up and funded by the U.S. government in other locations as well. These local organizations are providing similar services to address common major flaws or gaps in their respective immigration enforcement systems. Their interventions are showing the potential to influence government policy to make their systems more humane or to provide basic rights and protections to migrants. Next slide, please.
Our fifth and final principle relates to the subject of deportation. We insist in our report that forced removal should be used as a last resort and should not separate families or endanger migrant safety. Now, I'd like to emphasize here that we are not by any means pro-deportation, but where deportation does take place, we believe that this principle sets a minimum standard for humane treatment, that families should not be separated and migrant safety should be absolutely preserved. Now, this was one of the principles that is actually the most interesting because we were actually reluctant to take this subject up during our research. We were reluctant to look at whether or not it is possible even to call a deportation practice, quote-unquote, humane. But after speaking with people on the ground in El Salvador, for instance, we learned that this is actually an area of immense need, that people who are returning to their home countries frequently do not have the adequate resources to prosper, thrive, or even really just survive and meet their basic needs in their home countries. So we were interested in looking at interventions which might help people to acquire those resources and to acquire the things that they need to build their lives in their countries of origin. I'm sure all of you know about the problems that exist at the U.S.-Mexico border, so we're not going to get into those today. Instead, I'd like to speak to you about one of the other examples that we witnessed during the course of our field work, and that is the example of Germany. Now, before forcibly deporting someone, Germany sometimes gives people a window to leave on their own, and indeed sometimes people actually just choose to leave voluntarily. Germany has a long history, actually, of facilitating these what are called assisted voluntary returns. They've been doing this since the 1970s, where programs have been in place to give counseling and other types of assistance to migrants as they are preparing to return back to their countries of origin. And in 2017, 30,000 of such assisted voluntary returns took place. Now, there are problems with such programs. The scholarly literature talks about how these programs can be used by governments to kind of put on a humane face while actually trying to remove people from their national territory. So it looks good because you're actually helping the migrants, giving them money, some provisions, but in fact you're trying to advance a nativist agenda. This criticism obviously is legitimate. But we found, actually, talking with some of these people on the ground and notwithstanding these challenges, that in some situations, assisted volunteer return programs can actually be quite helpful. We had the opportunity to visit the office in Munich of a program called Coming Home, which is a repatriation assistance program that is a collaboration between the EU, the state of Germany, and I believe local governments in and around the Munich area. This program, along with other programs like it, gives migrants who are intent on returning to their home countries a modest sum of money upon return. It pays for transportation back to the home country and helps migrants wrap up some loose ends in Germany. This involves, for instance, helping migrants acquire necessary travel documentation, helping them acquire necessary vaccinations, find legal advice, and address special medical needs. And actually what we liked about this program was how personalized it is. We heard a story from the staff at Coming Home that we visited that we think actually exemplifies what it means to take migrants' individualized and personalized needs into account when repatriating. We heard of the case of an elderly Afghan couple who sensed that they were entering their very last days. And these two people, the wife and the husband, were both over 80. The wife had dementia. The husband had poor mobility because the husband had previously suffered a stroke. And the family home in Afghanistan could not support them. It was just not outfitted for people who with their mobility challenges. And so Coming Home actually paid for the construction of an additional room at the family home in Afghanistan, as well as disability accommodations for the couple. It also paid for medication for the couple and for a doctor to accompany them on the flight back to Afghanistan. Upon coming home, the wife's dementia actually partially improved because she was surrounded by all that was familiar to her from before, and the husband unfortunately passed away a year later. But nonetheless, the Coming Home staff were happy that the couple was able to spend their last days back in their native land. Of course, we think it is absolutely imperative that Germany and other countries not use these programs to refool, to send migrants back to places where their lives might be threatened, or otherwise to try to force people out of their countries. But this is the kind of thing that perhaps if it's scaled up to other countries might be useful in certain contexts.
So in the other two contexts, we generally witness an overall lack of services that provide assistance for people post-deportation, as well as the trend of increasing pressure to deport migrants more quickly and in higher numbers. For example, we wrote a bit about the trend towards the creation of hotspots in the context of the European refugee crisis, so that migrants can be deported faster. But in general, however, this is the area of our research that we were least able to develop due to resource and time constraints, but that we hope will generate more future research. And as a little aside, I want to mention that a new group of Notre Dame students, graduate students, will partner with MRS next year to focus in on this topic of post-deportation assistance to migrants. This is a policy issue that's gotten more attention in the last few years, especially given the media reporting that has highlighted a number of deaths or tragic situations that have faced migrants after being deported from the U.S. to Mexico and Central America. In particular, we found that the Migration Policy Institute has been organizing research and dialogue on the success of any existing post-deportation assistance programs in Central America and Mexico, some of which are organized by church networks and some funded by the U.S. government, so they're of particular interest to us. This research team has been doing some preliminary research on the issues of post-deportation outcomes for migrants in order to lay the groundwork for the next team, but we really are looking forward to them digging more into this issue. And we would love to hear any comments that you have in a minute about your experience with advocacy research on that issue. So we have one last slide, I think. Next slide, please. So in general, we would like to say, to kind of wrap up, that we believe that these straightforward and kind of overarching principles can help us think about common gaps in protections for migrants across different immigration enforcement systems, and how adherence to such principles through local efforts and also through policy change can make these systems more humane for migrants. So that has just been an overview of our report. The report goes into kind of much more detail as to what our observations on the ground were. But as for now, thanks so much for your attention, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions.
So, folks, there is a question here from a longtime JFI friend, Terry Angelotti. You can read it there in the chat box, but I'll go ahead and just ask it for you. When the researchers say forced removals should not separate families, how do they apply this to mixed status families, such as parents without documents and 3 U.S.-born minor children? I don't know if you folks can answer that, but I'll give you a shot at it.
Yeah, so the principles as we've articulated them are kind of high-level, overarching principles, pretty kind of abstract guidelines that we think should inform and guide policy. Now, with each particular policy question, I think it's incumbent upon the relevant policymakers acting in conformity with, the highest ideals of public policy making to find precise and specific ways to actually articulate these principles in practice. And so with respect to, for instance, the situation of 2 parents without documents and 3 U.S.-born minor children, of course, being U.S. citizens, this is a specific policy question that has to be asked within the U.S. context, and certain factors need to be taken into account. I know that recently changes have been made to the prosecutorial discretion regime that previously existed in the United States, which empowered immigration authorities to take, quote, family and community ties, end quote, into account when determining whether or not someone should be deported from the country. This was an Obama second-term guideline that existed from the DHS, and that has since been revoked by the Trump administration. So now the provisions allowing family and community ties to be taken into account when determining whether or not to deport someone have been rescinded. I think in the U.S. context, an articulation of the 5th principle we have would involve looking back at the previous policy that existed of being able to take family ties into account when making a deportation decision. I don't believe personally, and this is my own personal view, that would go far enough. Plenty of U.S. citizen children or parents of U.S. citizen children were deported under the previous administration, but it would be a good place to start to at least be able to consider the fact of family ties when making a determination as to whether someone should stay in the country, and having that be a formal provision that immigration authorities have to contend with.
Great. There's another question here from Isaac. Is there a standard or global repatriation process or policy, or is the process based on a country-by-country basis?
Yeah. So let's see. I'll just say a little bit about what I know. I think there are some efforts, some international organizations that kind of help organize these kind of processes, such as the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, has they develop these kind of voluntary return programs in various countries around the world, and they run them. So we were able to speak to the voluntary return program in Greece as well. And those kind of are similarly run in different countries. But I think in general, the way it's done is based on a country-by-country basis. The topic of kind of humane repatriation is something that's being picked up more by international bodies. I know that there's a number of recommendations about it that are in the Global Compact on Migration. But as for kind of standards for how that process should work on a global scale, I think those are still lacking. But that it's something that's been identified as a need to develop more. But as far as I know, there's no kind of global system in place.
Right, and I think just to add to this kind of might be deviating from the question a little, but our primary method of gathering information in the field was conducting interviews with relevant stakeholders. And I frequently ask the question of what can be done from an explicitly Catholic perspective, because a lot of the people we spoke to were affiliated with Catholic organizations and institutions. And one of the things that came up continually is that the Catholic Church, being an organization that exists both in sending and receiving countries, is one of those institutions that can facilitate some of this assistance because it understands the context in the destination countries, it understands the context in the sending countries, and its networks are transnational. So leveraging Catholic networks for the sake of preparing migrants to kind of better reintegrate into their home countries might be something that we would like to see, and that the church networks might be particularly adept at doing.
Very good. Are there other questions from folks on the webinar? If there are other questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box.
While people are thinking about questions to ask, I wanted to follow up on something that Kathleen said earlier regarding our next project with Notre Dame. We are looking to continue the partnership hopefully this summer, as she mentioned. And, we are looking for feedback from you all, not necessarily now, although we're happy to hear it, but certainly as we move into the future and kind of engage in the planning process. We're particularly interested, it looks like, at this juncture, at looking at the consequences related to deportation to El Salvador or Honduras. It looks like we may be partnering with a Catholic organization in one of those countries. I know there's a Catholic university, from what I understand, that Notre Dame has relationships with in El Salvador. I think it's a Jesuit university, which may function as a kind of base of operations when they are in that country. And the point of which is to really take a hard look at the consequences, what happens post-deportation, what kind of resources are available to those who are deported, what kind of opportunities emerge for those, reintegration processes, is there economic or financial support, is there a way for people to get back on their feet, what kind of threats reemerge when they've returned, how many stay, how many leave, are there risks to life and limb? Is anyone, God forbid, killed or injured as a consequence of their return, and any sort of repercussions from that from people who drove them out in the first place? So that's really kind of the broad area that we're looking at, it appears, at this point in time. So if anyone has any ideas related to organizations that we should reach out to, questions that we should be asking, policy issues that we should really be focusing on intentionally in that sort of a setting, please feel free to email Tony, and he can put you in contact with me. If you don't have my contact information, tscribner@usccb.org. I'll write it in the chat box in a second. But I just wanted to kind of throw that out in a little bit more detail and hope that, as we work with them, we can also work with you, because we want to be able to make sure that we touch on kind of all the points that are important to touch on an issue of this kind of significant, an issue that's as significant in nature as this one is.
So it looks like there's 3 more questions that showed up. You folks from Notre Dame, I mean, you're welcome to decide amongst yourselves which ones you want to take.
So yeah, I think I'll take the question from Rachel. In regards to the second and third principles, did you consider in your research the balance between government and NGO assistance to meet these needs, and were you able to identify any promising practices on this front? Actually, yes. So when we looked at some of the reception centers in Germany, for instance, we noted that a lot of them were actually run by non-governmental organizations. We had the experience of visiting the detention facilities in the United States, which are run by for-profit prison companies, right? We expect, as one would expect, they look like they're run by companies that are looking to make a profit. Corners are cut where they can be cut. Profits are maximized where they can be maximized. But I think that in terms of state partnerships with organizations that are not state actors, Germany offers a promising example of what might be an alternative model. Some of the reception centers are run by non-governmental organizations. We in particular visited one in a city called Donauwörth, which is run by the Order of Malta, as something I'm sure you are all familiar with. And this center really impressively looked at providing for migrants' needs from a comprehensive standpoint, an integrated standpoint. And we think that obviously the profit motivation not being there, the quality of life that migrants experienced in this center was far more adequate and more dignified than what was witnessed in the for-profit settings. So if non-governmental organizations could kind of get systemically involved in the process of housing migrants upon return, I think that could be a positive model. Secondly, there's another half of this question. Secondly, with respect to the state, what the state can do, we spoke to a lot of people who lamented the lack of legal counsel provided to migrants. This is one of the things that we noted. In the U.S., you're not entitled to legal counsel in a civil asylum case. In Germany, you're only entitled to free legal counsel at the appeals round, and only if the German authorities believe that you have a reasonable chance of winning your appeal. So the instances in which you can get government-funded legal assistance is really inadequate. But if the state were to provide such legal counsel to asylum seekers, it would actually end up improving efficiency. Because, we spoke with experts who believe this, including Christy DePena in this Cannon Center over in Washington, that by introducing legal counsel, by paying for legal counsel for migrants, you prevent a lot of the things that go with, just complete chaos, right? You make sure that migrants are filing their applications on time, that they're following the rules, that, they're inputting the information that one needs to in accordance with legal strictures to get asylum status. And so you actually reduce inefficiencies, the need for further appeals and further appeals beyond that. So that might be something that states might want to look into, that might actually, reduce headaches for them.
Okay, and I just want to add to this pretty comprehensive response that Patrick just gave. So regarding the third principle, that is information and accompaniment, we did find some best practices by NGOs. In McAllen, Texas, we saw the Catholic Charities run by Sister Norma, and then in Greece, as we discussed in the presentation, the Greek Council for Refugees is doing a great job. And the fact that NGOs have to step in and provide these services to migrants is basically due to the fact that in many of these areas, there isn't sufficient state capacity to respond to the growing needs. And so, at least in these two organizations, we did find instances of coordination between these NGOs and the state, and also best practices which can be ideally transferred from the NGO sector to the state.
And an example of that in our own context that Patrick sort of alluded to is this legal orientation program that the Florence Project, we mentioned briefly in the presentation that the Florence Project adopted many years back. The Florence Project is a legal aid program originally from Florence, Arizona, but that has been identified as extremely successful in their efforts to accompany migrants in the detention process and provide legal aid, and that government resources have thereafter been dedicated to expanding this kind of program to various other places. So what started off as an NGO or a nonprofit effort has been identified by the government as successful and useful and worthwhile to fund. As Patrick mentioned, that there have been studies that show that providing such legal aid does actually use less government resources in the long run. So this is an example, as Mehek said, that these kind of initiatives can be picked up by the government and funded on a larger scale. And as for the question after that, someone asked about the numbers of migrants who are evangelical rather than Catholic that are leaving Central American countries for the United States. Our report did not touch on that issue, but I would leave that up to Tony and Todd to see if they had any response to that.
I don't have any specific information offhand. I think you probably look to the Pew Forum. Might be a good resource if you're interested in getting more information. My sense they might have, some related to migration flows, from Central America and the demographic information of those populations. Migration Policy Institute might have some information on that as well. I can try to find it, but I don't have anything on hand.
We have other socioeconomic data about migrants leaving Central American countries, but I don't know if that data captures religious affiliation. I know that the Migration Policy Institute, for instance, has educational attainment and other demographic kind of characteristics, but I'm not sure if anyone has really surveyed the religion of people leaving. But it's possible that it's out there.
I think there are a couple of folks who are typing. Here we go. Okay. Let's give folks, another minute or two to pose any final questions they may have.
Sounds good.
Regarding the question up above, the USTB adopting these 5 principles of humane enforcement, I know of no formal plans in which we'd officially adopt these principles, but I would say that these principles don't seem in any way to be in contradiction to what we would affirm in principle. The devil's in the details when you apply it, obviously, but we worked closely with the 4 researchers to work through some thoughts and ideas that they had as these were being developed. So I don't think there's anything fundamentally inconsistent, even if we don't formally would sort of bring them on as official kind of sort of principles as such.
Thanks, Todd. I think that's it for questions. Before we close, I do want to give the research team from Notre Dame to present any last comments or any last thoughts before we end the webinar.
No last thoughts. We would just like to thank everyone again for joining us. It has been a pleasure to speak with you today and to answer your questions. I hope that this was helpful, and thanks again for having us.
Yes, well, thank you for the great work that you folks have done at the Keough School. Todd and I are expecting big things out of you folks, and hopefully we'll hear about how your careers kind of take off after you graduate here. We do want to thank you for presenting today. We also want to thank you again for speaking to the JFI group a couple of months ago when you were out here in D.C. Todd, great suggestion on having these folks present their research on the webinar. Thank you to everybody else who participated or who viewed and listened to the webinar. Again, this webinar will be available. It'll be posted on the JFI webinar website page, and that'll be available tomorrow. You can get to it at www.justiceforimmigrants.org. Thank you very much, everyone. We wish you all a blessed Holy Week and a happy Easter. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.